Committee will come to order. I thank you all for your patience with votes on the floor. We obviously got delayed. I'd actually like to start by recognizing the gentleman from North Carolina, who's the chairman of one of our subcommittees on the Subcommittee on Government Operations. Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for being incredibly flexible today. Really, I guess the underlying concern that I have is as we are celebrating the 25th anniversary, is we've got to figure out a way to get off of the high-risk list. It's not a very high benchmark. You know, really, if you look at the components of that, it is just making a real concerted effort. And so I'm looking forward to each one of you putting together a plan to make sure that we can do that. Doctor, let me come to you. I sent you a text, and I want to compliment you. Actually, sent you an email. I want to compliment you on the fact that on a weekend you responded via email, which was shockingly, surprisingly surprising, and I want to just say thank you. Do you have the automatic re-enrollment numbers that I've been requesting from CMS? Have they given those to you?
Yeah, Mr. Meadows, thanks for the question, and happy to be accessible whenever you need. The answer is, I think we're still working on it. You know, that is part of the agency, obviously, that I don't have direct oversight over. My understanding is that you've had numerous conversations with the CEO of the marketplace, Kevin Cunahan, and that they are working on assembling those numbers. I think, obviously, as you know, our focus is certainly on getting the numbers out to you and to the public, but making sure that they are accurate when we do.
All right, so what you're saying is you have not seen the numbers for the automatic re-enrollment. You've never seen any totals?
I have not, correct.
Okay. It's my understanding that we have those numbers, and we've been trying for 60 days to get it. Any reason why it would take that long to verify numbers?
I think it's just confirming that the numbers are numbers we can stand behind, making sure that they're good numbers that ought to be released. Again, I believe staff at CMS are in touch with your staff, and obviously you've been in touch with
Well, we've been in touch. They have not really been in touch.
Gotcha.
From a follow-up. It's amazing to me that we can have the response time for those that get recorded messages or wait times for Spanish-speaking operators, and we know that down to the second, or actually tenth of a second, and yet we can't get automatic re-enrollment numbers from CMS. When can we expect those?
I don't have a particular timeline.
All right. Well, let me go on further because I've got limited time. Let's look at Medicare. You're going from 14,000 lines of code to 68,000 codes in terms of Medicare reimbursement. Is that correct?
Are you talking about ICD-10?
Yeah, ICD-9 to ICD-10.
Sure.
So we're going to different codes.
Yes.
And so doctors and hospitals putting in the wrong code will come out as a improper payment or fraud. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. So it really
or improper payment.
It may. You know, obviously the importance of
why would we go from 14,000 codes to 68,000 codes? How could that make it more efficient?
Well, first let me say the agency is adopting these codes that are actually established outside of agency processes and with the input of the provider community. In fact, it was really the provider community searching for specificity and the ability to really define exactly what they were seeing in the
so they get their payments they wanted.
That they could get.
But let me ask you. I mean, I went through and looked at your codes. We've got codes now that one in particular says if you unexpectedly are missing your big toe, unexpectedly missing a big toe gets a code. There's 6 different codes for squirrels. I mean, so if a squirrel bites you, if it's the first time or second time, if it scratches you, do you not see that we've got unbelievable lines of code, that more codes will not make it more efficient? There's one code in here for spending too much time in a freezer. I mean, it's incredibly ridiculous. And let me tell you, the physicians that I talk to and the hospitals I talk to are spending millions of dollars in compliance trying to figure out your codes, and yet we're going to increase those by 4-fold? Why would you do that?
Well, again, I'd be just careful, and let me just say, I believe there's a code for an ORCA attack as well.
There
are
is.
numerous different kinds of codes. I don't imagine in my own practice to be using that one or many of the others.
Well, let me ask you, is a mouse a rodent?
Pardon me?
Is a mouse a rodent?
I assume it is.
Well, but you've got a different code for a rodent than a mouse. And, I mean, what I'm saying is it's so complicated, you make it so complicated that nobody can comply.
I think to be clear, though, the agency is a recipient of ICD-10, just as other agencies are. We did not invent ICD-10.
But you're in control of that, are you not? On implementing that, your program integrity?
I know. There are actually numerous parts of the agency. I mean, we are actually required to implement ICD-10. I realize the Congress has delayed implementation of that requirement, but at some point we are required to implement ICD-10, and that's meant to, the code design itself is not something that CMS is engaged in. It is really designed to improve both epidemiologic understanding of administrative data to make sure administrative data really reflects what's going on in the real world clinically, and that providers have had extensive input into these code sets. I don't necessarily disagree with your point, but I think we are as much a recipient of ICD-10 as other agencies that are implementing it across the world.
Well, my time's expired. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, Dr. Agarwal, I want to thank you for appearing before our committee today. CMS has undertaken a number of new initiatives to reduce fraud and improper payments in the Medicare program. I'm just concerned about how they work and how effective they are and what you see for the future. I'd like to ask you about these today. The ACA requires increased scrutiny of providers and suppliers who have historically pose a higher risk of fraud or abuse. This heightened screening process applies to providers and suppliers that are attempting to either newly enroll in the Medicare program or revalidate their participation. Can you describe the different risk-based screening level designations and the various requirements that providers and suppliers in each category are subject to?
Sure. So provider categories by provider type essentially are subdivided among 3 risk categories: limited, medium, and high. And as you go up the chain of risk, more screening strategies and approaches are implemented to screen those types of providers, again, whether they're newly enrolling or revalidating. At the highest level of risk, say a newly enrolling DME company or home health agency, there are automated background checks that would be performed that really are performed for all provider types to ensure adequate licensure, lack of a relevant criminal background or felony record that would keep a provider out of the program. But in addition, the highest risk providers face site visits, they face fingerprint-based background checks, so a multitude of different screening approaches for the highest risk providers. And that also includes providers who are attempting to re-enroll after having a program integrity action taken against them in the past. The result of all of this work, and to date we have revalidated over 1 million of the 1.5 million providers and suppliers enrolled in Medicare, and the totality of all this work on both newly enrolling and revalidation is that we have removed the billing privileges of over 450,000 enrollments in Medicare to date. And I can tell you that these new enrollment requirements are also allowing us to deny more applications at the front end, so providers actually never make it into the program because they do not qualify.
Well, that's what I was about to ask you. So as opposed to chasing money, you do some preventive things, is that right?
I think a lot of our provider enrollment work really solidly lands in the preventive category because it really is designed to keep folks out of the program that don't belong. So if we conduct a site visit and determine that you are a non-operational provider, then you never make it into the program. Or if we check your criminal background record or check your licensure and determine that you're not appropriately licensed or you have a relevant felony conviction that would keep you out of the program, then indeed we deny your enrollment application.
Okay. Let me ask you about the agency's demonstration program on power mobility devices. How does the agency's prior authorization demonstration for power mobility devices complement CMS's program integrity efforts?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So One of the central challenges in the improper payment rate is that there is a disconnect between the medical record documentation that underlies a medical service or indicates what happened over the course of that medical interaction, and then the claim that comes into CMS, essentially the bill for that interaction. What prior authorization does is it allows us to ensure that medical necessity requirements and documentation requirements are being met on the front end before the service is even offered to the beneficiary. The demonstration and generally the way we've approached prior authorization is, again, to take a very risk-based approach. The demonstration was implemented around power mobility devices first. We put out a proposed rule that would look to expand that to other high-cost DME supplies, and then there are elements in the President's budget that look to expand it to things like hyperbaric oxygen and scheduled ambulance transportations. But all of it is the same principle which the private sector uses every day of evaluating the service before it's even provided, determining that it's okay, and then the beneficiary gets the service and the provider gets paid.
Now, is the beneficiary adversely affected?
I think that's a really important aspect of this. So by checking on the front end, before the service is even provided, that the documentation is appropriate and that medical appropriateness and necessity are there, it prevents the beneficiary from unnecessarily or potentially being on the hook for a denied claim. So the service was never provided, right? That way, neither the provider is on the hook for a service that they provided but then are not getting paid for, and the beneficiary is not on the hook for having received a service that the provider is not going to then get paid for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. We now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Estevez, just today the Hill newspaper says in an article, before signing on to increase Pentagon spending to its highest level ever, Congress should insist on a serious effort to identify and address wasteful spending by the Pentagon. Among major Federal agencies, the Pentagon is the only one never to submit, let alone pass, a full audit. Another article said Pentagon leaders have requested to step up production of the F-35, the beleaguered jet fighter that has proven to be a massive drain on resources with no end in sight. $7.5 billion sunk into the F-35 in fiscal year 2014 alone, with massive cost overruns and egregious acquisition failures. Over the years, I've read so many articles about waste at the Pentagon, and I sometimes wonder if there are any fiscal conservatives at the Pentagon. But what do you say? How much do you have any estimate as to how much we've spent on the F-35 so far? And are you concerned about this article that's in the Hill today that talks about wasteful spending by the Pentagon?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. First, we're always concerned about any wasteful spending at the Pentagon, and we have a number of processes in place to address spending in general, including looking at our overhead and functions and looking at our acquisition processes. Let me address the F-35. I don't have the number total spent to date. F-35 costs per plane have gone down below our estimations since it was rebaselined in 2010. It's actually producing a pretty good airplane, and I think the F-35 is stuck on old news.
You're the principal deputy for acquisition, and do you have any rough guess as to how much we've spent on the F-35 thus far? Any wild, rough guess?
I'm going to have to get you that for the record.
You don't know?
It goes back to 2004, Congressman.
Right. All right. Dr. Agrawal, I met last week with hospitals from East Tennessee, and they told me that many hospitals in Tennessee are either going to have to close or about to go under or probably end up being sold to some big out-of-state corporations because of the unfairness in their Medicare wage index. And they said that the system that CMS has now rewards very expensive, inefficient hospitals and penalizes hospitals that have held their costs down or that have continually lowered their costs. Have you looked into this? I mean, it's the difference between what hospitals are being paid, say, in San Francisco or in comparison to Tennessee or Mississippi or places like that, it's just almost unbelievable. These hospitals are being paid twice as much for mostly the same type of work. What can you tell me about that? Is CMS looking into this or concerned about these huge discrepancies at all?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. We do have processes for hospitals and other providers to engage us in terms of wage discrepancies like that. I can tell you that we have a very proactive approach to, say, the misvalued codes that we know exist, and reevaluating those codes, ensuring that our coding approach and reimbursement approach is really paying for valuable services that, taxpayers expect, that we all want the program to provide. So there is I think the core message is there is a process for doing that, and we're happy to engage with hospitals and other providers on these kinds of questions.
Well, I will tell you this, I don't have much time left, but years ago, a hospital administrator in a small town in Tennessee, he told me, he said, if you don't have hospitals, you don't get doctors, and if you don't get doctors, you don't get people. And there are many rural hospitals that are really struggling in this country today because of these discrepancies between what they're getting in comparison to some of the very wasteful, very inefficient big city hospitals. And I think that's something that you really need to take a look at, because it's very unfair. And I could give you all kinds of statistics about that I won't bother you with today, but it's getting to be a very serious problem in my state. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. We're recognizing members based on seniority when we gavelled in. So the gentleman's up next is actually from South Carolina, Mr. Mulvaney. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Koskinen, when I sat down, this is my first hearing, and when I sat down to do the research on the GAO report, which is the subject of today's hearing, I sort of got sidetracked. And I want to talk to you about some other things, because one of the things I found in doing the research was a report that I think just came out today. In fact, it's just being reported today, that your agency is reporting that the tax refund fraud will be $21 billion this year. That's up about 300% from just a couple years ago. And that number stunned me, just out of curiosity. I think it's more than we spend on the entire Department of Agriculture. You could run the Treasury, the Judiciary, the SEC, the SBA, and your IRS with that money and still have a couple $1 billion left over. Mr. Estevez, just out of curiosity, for your interest, sir, I could buy you 140 F-35s just on what we're going to lose this year in tax refund fraud. You could run my state, South Carolina, for 3 years on that money. And that's not all the fraud occurring in the IRS. It's just the tax refund fraud. Anyway, that research led to the research that I wanted to ask you about, which is your testimony last week before the Senate, where Mr. Grassley, Senator Grassley, asked you some questions about the impact within the Internal Revenue Code and within your department of what the President has done on executive amnesty. And I think you went back and forth with Senator Grassley and asked you about people who are benefiting from the amnesty, claiming the Earned Income Tax Credit in arrears for up to 3 years. You remember that testimony with Senator Grassley?
I do.
And I don't know if we established what that would cost. Have you had a chance to figure out what the total cost of that program would be?
I have not, but before I get there, I don't know where the $31 billion in refund fraud came from.
$21 billion.
$21 billion came from. As GAO testified, we stopped last year about $16 billion worth of refund fraud, and only $5 billion is our estimate what went through, which is still a big number and we're worried about, but it isn't $21 or $31 billion that's going out the door. Now, with regard to the question you asked earlier, to be eligible for the Earned Income Tax Credit, you have to work. It's in the Earned Income Tax Credit.
Correct.
To be able to apply for it, you have to have a Social Security number.
Okay.
So if you are, we have about 700,000 ITINs out there by illegal immigrants who are paying taxes.
Correct.
But they're not eligible to apply because they don't have a Social Security number.
But several million of them will get Social Security numbers under the new program, right?
And under the new program, if you get a Social Security number and you work, you'll be eligible to apply for the Earned Income Tax Credit. You will get an amount depending on your situation. If you're an individual working and applying for the individual tax credit, the maximum you can get will depend. It's been in the range of about $500 or $600.
Now, let's drill down on this a little bit, Mr. Koskinen, because there was some apparent lack of clarity in the interpretation of what you said in the Senate. I want to clear this up. is the Earned Income Tax Credit only going to be available to illegal immigrants who filed taxes previously, or is it going to be available to all of them who receive Social Security numbers under the new program?
It turns out, and there was a lack of clarity about that, if you get a Social Security number, you can then file for this year if you're working, and if you earned income in the 3 years before that and filed, you'll be eligible. If you did not file, you'll have to file a return, and you'll have to file to demonstrate with the same information you would anybody else would that you actually earned income and therefore were eligible. There was some assumption that you would get the Earned Income Tax Credit automatically whether you were working or not.
So it will be available to everyone who was working even if they didn't file in the previous 3 years?
That is my understanding, yes.
And you have no idea how much this is going to cost?
I don't know how many people are going to get Social Security numbers, how many will be
True,
single.
but we do this all the time. Did the White House not ask you to estimate that?
I haven't talked to the White House about this at all.
Did anyone at the White House ever consult with your office before they issued the executive orders that gave rise to the executive amnesty?
They didn't consult with me, and to my knowledge, they didn't consult with anyone else. I'm not aware of any consultation.
Are you aware that if we were to do what the President did by legislation, that he did by executive order, that we would have to go and get an estimate of exactly what you and I are talking about here today?
From the Joint Committee on Taxation?
Or CBO, yes, sir.
Or CBO, yes, sir.
So if we did the same thing the President did by law, we would have to know the answer to that question, but the President doesn't have to know the answer to that question before he did what he did.
The President may know the answer to that question. He wouldn't come to us necessarily to get the answer. He would go to OMB.
But by the same token, didn't ask you for any input. Did he ask you, for example, about the any increase in the risk of fraud?
No, we had no conversations with the White House that I'm aware of. I certainly personally have not talked. I've never talked to the White House about any of this.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Koskin. I appreciate that.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the Chairman. And I wanted to talk about the IRS targeting of conservative groups and frankly, the pattern of deception and delay that we've seen from this administration. And I would just remind the committee, you don't take my word for it. Just yesterday, in the Hill, front page, Feds won't release IRS targeting documents. So you don't take my word. Take Bob Cusack, editor of The Hill, respected mainstream journalist, talking about the deception and delay from this administration. I think it's important we remember the whole saga here. February 2012, Lois Lerner told this committee's staff that there was no targeting going on. Turned out to be a lie, of course. March 23, 2012, Doug Shulman, then Commissioner, told the Ways and Means Committee he can give assurances that there's no targeting going on. Also a false statement. May 2013, that day when Lois Lerner went in front of a bar association here in D.C. with a planted question, again, unprecedented, to get in front of the story, went before the Inspector General released a report and talked about the targeting by the IRS of conservative groups. And I quote from remember, she talked to Treasury and the White House about this, from Mr. Cusack's article yesterday, and I quote, then Chief of Staff Mark Pedersen at Treasury informed the White House about the plan to disclose the targeting, quote, so that the White House wouldn't be surprised by the news. So think about this. Planted question, before the Inspector General's report comes out, she discloses that, and the White House and the Treasury already knew it was going on. And then, of course, we have Ms. Lerner talking about Cincinnati was the problem and not Washington. That was false, and the White House says it's a phony scandal, no corruption, not even a smidgen, which brings me to Mr. Koskinen, the current commissioner. February 14th of last year, we subpoenaed you for all of Lois Lerner's emails. Put up slide number 1. Just a few weeks later, March 26th, in this committee room, the chairman of the committee, Mr. Chaffetz, asked you a question. Are you going to provide all of Lois Lerner's emails? And your response was, yes, we will do that. You remember that conversation, Mr. Koskinen?
I remember that conversation. You reminded me of it a couple of times.
Yeah, and I'm going to keep doing that because the American people are frustrated and mad about what the IRS did to them regarding their First Amendment free speech rights. June 13th, you sent a letter to Senate Finance saying, we lost Lois Lerner's emails and destroyed, the hard drive's been destroyed and the tapes are destroyed. You remember that letter you sent to Senate Finance, Mr. Koskinen?
I do remember that.
10 days after that letter was sent, you came back to this committee room and we asked you some questions. Let's put up the second slide. I asked you specifically, what date did you learn you couldn't get all her emails? Remember that conversation, Mr. Koskinen?
I remember that conversation.
And your response was, I learned in April. So my question to you is, today, will you admit that you misled this committee, the U.S. Congress, and more importantly, the American people, just like Ms. Lerner was doing, just like Mr. Schulman was doing, will you admit that you misled the Congress and the American people?
No, absolutely not.
You don't think you misled them?
No.
So you told Mr. Chaffetz, yes, we'll give you all her emails. A few days later, you learn in April, that was March, in April you learn you can't, and you wait 2 months to tell us, and you don't think that's misleading the American people?
I do not. We waited 6 weeks to tell you, and we waited those times to find as many of the emails as we could, and as we reported.
So let me ask you this. Have you sent the chairman a letter saying that what you told him on March 26th, yes, we will get you all Lois Lerner's emails. Have you sent Chairman Chaffetz a letter saying, you know what I told you on March 26th isn't true?
As I noted in a hearing, we've had several hearings, I still tell you, we said we will give you all the Lois Lerner emails. We gave all the Lois Lerner emails we had. As I told you once before, we couldn't make up Lois Lerner emails. We didn't have them produce them. We gave you all the emails that we had, and we continued to look for those.
You said, I'll give them all to you, and then you write a letter to the Senate Finance saying you lost them, you destroyed them. Have you done anything to correct the record?
Actually, we didn't lose them and destroy them. They were lost in that period of time in 2012. And when we testified in June, I testified that we waited the 6 weeks while we tried to provide you as much emails as we could, and there were 24,000.
Put up slide 4. Put up slide 4. This is the letter you sent. And you said you can confirm that no backup tapes existed. So you confirmed that you couldn't get us all her emails, and you've done nothing to correct the record when you told Mr. Chaffetz you were going to give all of them to us. And you waited 2 months before you ever told us that you lost them.
I waited 6 weeks so we could provide you all the emails we could find. We've provided you 24,000 emails from the time of her hard drive crash, and we said in the backup tapes did not exist because they had been re-recorded over.
Mr. Chairman,
so we at that time gave you all the emails.
I got one more question, Mr. Chairman, just in the last 10 seconds if I could. Have you withdrawn the letter, understanding that now TIGTA has told us that her emails are recoverable on the backup tapes? Have you withdrawn the letter that you sent to Senate Finance where you confirmed that those tapes weren't there? And I bring this up, Mr. Chairman, because this committee has some experience with letters being withdrawn. In 2011, the Justice Department, after making inaccurate statements regarding Fast and Furious, sent a letter to then Chairman Issa, and they said this: facts have come to light during the course of this investigation that indicate the letter, the February 4th letter, contains inaccuracies. Because of this, the Department now formally withdraws the February 4th letter. So what I want to know, Mr. Koskinen, is when are you going to be square with the American people and withdraw false and misleading statements you've sent this committee, and more importantly, the letter you sent to Senate Finance? Are you going to withdraw that letter?
Absolutely not. We can have this argument for a long time. TIGTA, by the way, has spent 6 months and untold amounts of money trying to extract those emails from those backup tapes. So the idea that we could somehow—
You said you could confirm they didn't even exist.
The backup tapes, if you go through my records, you will find I've said the backup tapes—
Will you withdraw the letter that had falsehoods in it? That's what I'm asking.
There is no reason. There are no falsehoods, and there's no reason to withdraw that letter. I stand by that letter.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Koskinen, Monday and Tuesday of this week, I did 2 live town halls back in my district and 1 teletown hall. And at 2 of those events, the issue that was brought up, same story that came out in the Washington Post with the headlines, IRS rehired hundreds of ex-employees with troubled records, came up. And it basically came up from my constituents saying, you know, why can we not get away with the same things that were recorded there? In the article, it indicated that between 2010, January, and September 2013, the IRS rehired 7,000 employees. A great jobs program, and we're always delighted when people are employed, but the question comes from my people as to why over 800 of those 7,000 rehired IRS employees were rehired with prior substantial employment issues, including 11 individuals who engaged in unauthorized access to taxpayer information. And that really discourages and frustrates my citizens. that these people, 11 of them, who engaged in unauthorized access to taxpayer information, which is a crime, as we understand it, were rehired. Why?
The bulk of those employees are temporaries or seasonals who are hired for 4 to 6, 8 months a year, depending on the time. They should not be rehired.
Even though they committed a crime, you're saying they should not. Why were they rehired?
They should not, because the process at that point in time in 2009 to 2011 into 2012 followed, as the IG said, the OPM rules and regulations, which in fact would have allowed those people to be applied. We consolidated in 2012 all of those hiring issues into our personal security division, and I have made sure that if you have violated, it all is under a section called 1203B. If you have worked for the IRS and violated section 1203B, you will not be rehired.
Well, according to TIGTA, they said it still remains concerned because in 2012 and 2013, IRS hired individuals with prior significant IRS substantiated conduct and performance issues. What are you doing? I mean, this was subsequent to that.
Yes, and what the IG recommended, the IG again in that report said that was all pursuant to and we followed the OPM rules. What the IG said is we should make sure that we make sure before we hire someone, we've actually reviewed all of this. And as I said, we now do that. We took the IG's recommendation. And I have talked with our personnel people since the IG started raising this issue, which I think is an important issue in December, and to make sure that in this consolidation with our personal security people, if you have violated 1203B, which is willful violations of taxes or access to taxpayer information, you won't be hired.
Let me proceed further then, and I hope this is a general trend. The audit identified 141 individuals that were rehired that had a prior tax issue, with 5 of them having been found by IRS management to have willfully not filed their taxes. How many of these employees are still working?
They're all seasonal employees, so I don't know. A lot of them don't come back the next year, so I don't know how many of those there were. I would note that the 141, we take the requirement of IRS employees to be tax compliant very seriously. Our compliance rate is over 99%. We hold people accountable even if their mistakes are inadvertent. Even if they make modest mistakes, we count that as not compliance. What we are concerned about is the 5 employees you mentioned that have been found to willfully not pay their taxes and violate the tax laws, and those people are subject to termination.
Could you get us information for this committee of people we're referring to here that are still employed?
I will find the information. The 141, if you've had a minor minor mistake, those you would get cited for, but those aren't basis for termination. The 5 you mentioned that had a willful violation finding, I will find out the information and get it back to you.
I appreciate that. What about those, not the tax issue, but had substantial prior employment issues, attendance issues, misrepresentation of what they were doing if they were on the job?
There's again, as I say, the consolidation now, we have a personal security department that reviews every offer before it is made to make sure that we've gone over all of that. Some personal activities are, you didn't show up for work for 2 days. Others are, you had a significant problem, and we distinguish between those. And the OPM rules are very clear about that, that if just because you've had a performance issue in your file doesn't mean you can never work again for the IRS. It depends on the nature and the duration of the affair. But it is important for people to be confident, even though 80%, as the TIGTA report said, 80% of these people are temporaries and seasonals who don't necessarily work even for half the year. It is important for us to make sure that we have the appropriate people working. And so I take the TIGTA report, I'm a big supporter of IGs, because they continue to review these issues, and we take it seriously. We have implemented their recommendations. We have a personal security group now that ensures before an offer goes out, if you have violated 1203B, which is the 2 most serious issues, you don't get hired. And if there are other conduct issues, not only are we going to follow the OPM rules, we're going to review those for appropriateness for work at the IRS. And I think it's important for people to be comfortable that we do take it seriously and that people working for the IRS ought to be tax compliant. If we're collecting your taxes, we ought to be paying ours.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would like that information on those that are still employed that came under these 824.
The 824 covers a large range.
A lot. But
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to give Mr. Koskinen a break here for a minute and talk with Mr. Lightfoot, if that's okay.
I don't want you to think that's not appreciated.
Well, that doesn't mean I won't come back to you. Mr. Lightfoot, NASA's done a good job in making progress on getting off the high-risk list, but there's still some issues. I'm obviously from Alabama. NASA's a major presence in our state. But there have been some issues with rebaselining cost and schedule in light of management and technical issues. Can you address that on some of your projects?
Yes, sir. We have the process we go through where we review these projects on a routine basis. We have some, while we've had some that have done really well, we continue to make good progress on those 8 out of the last 9 that have launched that came in under the baseline. Once we go through confirmation, what we call confirmation of a project, which moves it from formulation to development, that's when we make a commitment for a certain cost and schedule that we're going to try to live to. The process we have where we review those all monthly, occasionally we have one that pops up and it gives us an issue. We've had 2 of those, the Space Ground Sustainment System that we have, and then the ISAT-2 project, which are two issues we have going, where we were required to then go back and baseline. When you rebaseline, you go through a process of analysis of alternatives. Is there another way you can get that particular mission accomplished? Can you de-scope the existing mission so that you can still stay within the cap? So that's what we go. That's the process we go through. Each one of those has lessons. Those lessons, one of the things that we've been really working on is factoring those back in and continuing to improve our process as we go forward for the rest of those projects.
At a prior time in my life, I worked for a couple of major engineering companies, and one of the things that drives a client crazy, particularly one paying the bill, is change orders. You've got some projects that I don't know if it's a result of design changes or poor design to begin with that are running some substantial overruns on change orders. Could you address that?
Yes, sir. I think the one you're talking about in particular is the ground systems project that we had. This was the first time that we've actually applied the same project management methodology that we had for the spacecraft that we've been flying to a ground system. And one of the things, that's an upgrade to our ground networks that actually communicate with all the satellites we have on orbit. That system is basically becoming obsolete. So what we did is we went out and we tried, we knew we had a pretty large job in front of us, and we said, let's try those program project techniques that we've been doing for spacecraft, one-of-a-kind things, to a ground system. We've learned a few lessons in that process. The the first one is that we have to be very clear on our requirements, much to what you're talking about, and understand and make sure we understand that the contractor that's doing that work understands those requirements as well. So we've gone back and forth with this in terms of trying to define better the expectations we have for the contractor and then managing that contractor. In this particular case, we've changed out the entire contract management team and the team that we have in terms of our managing it. And since we've done that, we have managed to stay, from an earned value perspective, we stayed at the levels that we expected.
So this is, would you say this is the result of a design of a project that the schedule dictated the design, or is this something where you're entering a new area and you're designing as you go?
No, I think this is a case where we underestimated the type of work we needed to do to deal with the obsolescence issues that we had in front of us in terms of designing the software system that we were putting in place with the new equipment.
All right. I believe that's all I have. I'll yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. So now I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And Mr. Koskinen, since you had a break, I thought it only appropriate to come back to you and ask you a couple of questions that were on my mind in particular. Based on previous testimony, you've made it clear that the ability of the IRS to make progress in the areas that have been outlined by the GAO have been largely hindered due to reductions in funding. And this is kind of a personal question to me because of my involvement with nonprofit organizations. And the IRS has spent millions of dollars to basically rewrite the governing rules for 501c4s or what have you, different nonprofit organizations, specifically potentially removing tax-exempt status if those organizations are involved in political activity. My question is multiple. It's rather amazing personally that there would be an issue of trying to hinder speech of Americans. My specific question really comes down to how much money, can you tell me how much money the IRS has spent on writing and the attempt to rewrite that specific section of the 501c4 ruling? I know it was withdrawn, but my understanding is that there is an attempt now to rewrite that. I'm curious how much money is being spent to that end.
I don't know. The only money that's being spent is the lawyers that have been working on the drafting of this, and they haven't been spending full time, so it is not a large amount, but I could try to get an estimate of how many people worked on it. Some of the work on the first version was done before I got there, but if you'd like, we can try to figure out on a rough estimate as the man hours, but the only time spent was, as I say, a relatively small number of lawyers who were working on it. But I would note that the goal here is not to hinder. As I said when I started and kind of inherited all of this, the goal is, in fact, to try to make clear what the rules are in a way that is fair to everybody, all of the organizations. It's clear and easy to administer. Right now, the rule that's been there a long time is you judge both the determination as whether you're eligible to be a 501c4 and then whether you're performing under the statute by facts and circumstances. So that means anybody running an organization is running the risk, looking over their shoulder, saying, is somebody going to have a different view of the facts and circumstances? So my sense is that we ought not to be hindering political speech. We ought not to be changing the way people act. But what we ought to have is and the IG in his recommendation said the Treasury Department and the IRS should clear up what the standard is for what amount, how much, and what the definition is of the political activity you can engage in. And my sense is that it ought to be possible to have a rule that would be clearer, easier for people in those organizations running them to understand, and fair to everyone, and that would not be hindering political speech. So it's not my intention anyway in looking at that to do that. My sense and concern is that the present system has, over the last several years, by the IG's analysis, turned out to be unworkable. And I think it would be in everybody's interest if, again, it could be clearer what the rules are without hindering people, and they would be able to run organizations confident that somebody isn't going to come in and second-guess them on the facts and circumstances that they've been operating under.
Well, I would agree we certainly need clarification in that, but I would also strongly urge a very clear understanding of the freedoms of Americans, that just because someone is a part of a nonprofit organization, they have not waived their First Amendment rights. And that is a tremendous threat that the IRS has, in my opinion, no business interfering with, and that is a deep concern.
I agree with you, and in fact, my sense is that the rules, if they're fair and clear to everyone, will in fact create less of a constraint on people's right to free speech than the present rules, which are muddy and hard to interpret.
Okay, one other question, and I will yield my time. Again, going back to the issue that the main problem has been lack of funding. The issues from the GAO have come up with the IRS for some 25 years or close to it. It's been a long time that we've had issues. And yet, a few years ago in 2010, the IRS had more funding than they've ever had. And these problems, these issues have still not been addressed.
Well, that's not quite true, because we did have more money in 2010 by a long shot. And as I noted in my testimony, in 2013, as a result of some of that spending on information technology, the information technology business system modernization problem for the IRS was taken off the high-risk list after having been there for 14 years. So it has been true and proven that, certainly in the IT area, that if we have the funding, we can make significant progress.
And that's great for the IT area, but there's many other areas that need to be addressed, and 25 years is far too long. It's time to put some teeth to it, sir. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis, for 5 minutes.
Commissioner Koskinen, it was a year ago where the senior IRS leadership learned that Lois Lerner's hard drive had crashed. There was an issue about getting her emails off backup tapes. You wrote a letter to Senate Finance in June of 2014 saying that there were problems with Lerner's emails and that the backup tapes had been destroyed. And then on June 20th, you testified before the Ways and Means Committee that the IRS went to, quote, great lengths and made, quote, extraordinary efforts to recover Lerner's emails. So let me ask you this. After the IRS became aware that Lerner's hard drives had crashed, what specific steps did the IRS take to locate any backup tapes or disaster recovery tapes?
The disaster recovery tapes at the IRS are recorded over when they're used until they're no longer usable. So there is no technique or capacity in the IRS to actually retrieve emails off of those tapes. What we did do was go to everybody in the what's so-called custodial list at that point of about 80 different people that Ms. Lerner would have been communicating with, because we were looking for all emails. We'd already produced all the emails that were relevant to the determination process. We were then trying to respond to all. So we looked at all of those 82 and took every email that was to or from Lois Lerner, compared them against emails already produced.
But that would not have been backup tapes. That was from their hard drives or their accounts.
Their hard drives.
So the backup tapes, you had made the judgment that they simply were not going to be recoverable, or did you actually have somebody investigate whether you could have backup tapes or you could find some backup tapes?
Our experts said we had no way that they were not recoverable. It's taken the IG 6 months, the last 2 or 3 months working on, he tells us around the clock, and he still hasn't gotten them produced, and we still don't know how many there are. But my position all along has been with the IG, because we helped him find what the backup tapes were that had been recorded over from that time, is if he could find more emails, that would be terrific. And I actually mean that seriously, because it would lend even more light than the 24,000 we already produced into what were in those emails in that time frame. So
yeah, but why would the IG be able to find it if you guys couldn't find it? You said you went through extraordinary lengths.
Well, because the IG, when we discovered this in the spring, and then we reported it in June 6 weeks later, within a couple of weeks thereafter, the IG started his investigation, so we had no more time. And I will tell you today, if we started today, it's taken the IG, and I don't know how much money they're spending, it's taken them over 6 months to, in fact, recover whatever they're going to recover. And that was,
let me ask you this.
We don't have that capacity.
Did the IRS ever collect any tapes or send any backup tapes to any forensic lab in your investigation, the people that you detailed to do this? Was that any tapes recovered, any tapes ever sent to a lab by the IRS?
No.
Okay. Now, who told you that the backup tapes would not yield any emails from Lois Lerner's crashed hard drive?
I was told that by our Information Technology Department.
And what was, do you know the basis for that statement? Did you inquire as to how they could be sure of that?
Basically, what they described to me was they have these disaster recovery tapes. They are actual tapes. And then when the 6 months, they keep them for 6 months. And when the 6 months is done, they simply reuse them and record over them. And as you know, if you ever had tapes, when you record over them, then in the normal process, the data underneath them is gone. And in fact, I was told that we had no capacity and no way that you could actually recover those. And in fact, they were not sure that there was any way you could recover them.
Has the IRS communicated with Lois Lerner, her attorneys, about recovering the emails from any of her crashed hard drives?
No, I've had no communication with Lois Lerner about this at all. I've never met her.
Let me ask you this. In the course of the IRS's response to this committee's investigation, has the IRS withheld any information or documents from Congress on any other basis other than 6103?
No. We've had some that we've asked the staff to review in camera because they are basically personal matters that have nothing to do with the investigation. But we've exercised no privilege. We aren't trying to keep anything from you. In fact, we've continued to respond to requests and continue to provide any information we can find.
And you would say that your responses to the requests from this committee have been above and beyond what is required in this situation?
No, I don't think they're above and beyond. We have, when you want information and ask for it, we have an obligation to do our best to provide it, and we've done that. I don't think that's above and beyond. Anytime you want
extraordinary efforts aren't above and beyond?
Extraordinary efforts were, in fact, when we discovered the crash, then it was my decision and thought that we needed to do whatever we could to fill in that gap, and we did find 24,000 emails we provided. My understanding from news reports, because the IG doesn't tell us a lot of stuff about this, is that the IG may be able to find another 9,000 or 10,000 lowest learner emails.
So you just, final question is, you made the effort, you were not cavalier about this, you made the effort to find what the committee wanted. Is that your testimony?
That's my testimony.
Thanks. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. We'll now recognize the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The book of Ecclesiastes teaches us there's a time and a season for everything, and you convinced me earlier this evening that this is not the time to question Mr. Koskinen. He was here for GAO-related testimony and not IRS, and I don't know whether he's prepared for the questions or not. We'll not find out, because I believe that you have agreed at some point he's going to come back before the committee, and I was wondering if the Chairman might engage in a colloquy with me to make sure that my chronology is correct. I thought the last time that Commissioner Koskinen was in front of us, there was a robust discussion about the time period within which he was going to produce emails. And he had asked us to narrow the scope so that he could prioritize and get us those emails that we had asked for. And of course, as the Chairman will recall, we need those emails because the emails we do have from Lois Lerner contain such jewels as lamenting GOP wins, celebrating Democrat wins, forecasting gloom and doom if the GOP, God forbid, ever controlled the Senate, saying that we needed a plan to overcome Citizens United. Those were just some of the emails that I recall, Mr. Chairman. And if my chronology holds, after Commissioner Koskinen told us that he would prioritize the production of those emails, of course, they magically disappeared. And then the IRS, of course, Mr. Chairman, employed Herculean efforts to recover those emails. They were not successful, but then talismanically after the election, or just talismanically, they did appear at some point, and now we are reading that 500 of those emails will not be made available due to the invocation of a privilege. Does the Chairman know what privilege the White House is relying upon to not produce those documents to Congress?
I do not.
Do you know whether the President has had an opportunity to review those 500 documents?
It's a good question.
Do you think there's a chance that his conclusion that not a smidgen of corruption exists in this investigation might be altered if he did have an opportunity to review what's in those documents?
Certainly.
Will you consider inviting Mr. Koskinen back to update us on this chronology?
Yes, indeed.
All right. Well, Mr. Koskinen, Commissioner, I'm not going to question you today because I think the hearing title was something else. But I hope at some point we can go back to where we left off, which was an assurance from you that you were going to prioritize email productions. And I hope at some point, Mr. Chairman, we can evaluate the refusal to turn over certain documents to Congress, the invocation of privilege. And I hasten to add, as the Chairman remembers, because of his service on Judiciary and Oversight, this administration has invoked executive privilege before, only for us to then learn that that privilege was invoked to protect an email that the Attorney General sent to his wife. Under what theory of executive privilege is that email protected? So I hope that I live long enough to see the production of those emails, and I certainly hope I live long enough to see the Commissioner come back before us. And with that,
the gentleman yield.
Yeah. Could I just make one clarification? During the course of all of the document production, Treasury Department turned over all of its Lois Lerner emails, and the White House made a representation that they had no Lois Lerner emails. So in terms of that process, and in fact this committee issued a report in December noting that in fact there was no evidence that anyone outside of the IRS, whether at the White House or Treasury, had any impact or influence over as the IG said, improper use of criteria for the determination process for C4. So I don't know what the documents over there are. There's been a litigation around the Inspector General investigating communications, but that's not a case between us and the IRS. Is not a party to that.
No, it's not, which is in part why I directed my questions to the Chairman and not to you. But if you would like us to have this conversation, I will ask you, do you understand why Congress wants those emails? Can you understand as a trained attorney why we might want access to all the documents?
I can understand that. My understanding was that the White House some time ago certified there were no lowest learner emails, and Treasury gave you all of their lowest learner emails.
Well, then what are they claiming privilege?
And we'll have more occasions. I think this is my sixth appearance before this committee. I look forward to the seventh, and we'll talk about it, and we'll be delighted to give you an update. And I will be delighted if the Inspector General can ever complete his work. It's now going after 6 months to produce those emails, because then all of us will learn what was in them. And I have been totally supportive of the IG, and my view really is if there are emails that can be done, and the IG apparently in the public press it's been said has been able to find them, I think that will be a major step forward, and I look forward to discussing that with you.
Well, I know I'm out of time, but you can appreciate our cynicism and our skepticism, because it appears as if sometimes the strategy is just to delay and obfuscate and wait and wait and wait until either the public loses interest or until there's a new administration. So I know you can appreciate our desire to have those documents sooner rather than later.
I can, and I thoroughly understand that.
I thank the gentleman.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I haven't had a chance to ask questions. And I'd like to remind my colleagues why we're here. The 5 of you are very presentable. You put a happy face on the difficult situation. But here's the reality. 25 years in a row, your agencies, these problems have come before Congress. 25 years in a row. This is the all-star team of problems. That's the reality. You can try to put lipstick on this pig, but the reality is it's ugly. To get on this list, you have to be engaged in waste, fraud, and abuse in excess of $1 billion a year. Now, to get off the list, granted, it's not easy, but here are the criteria for getting off the list. Leadership commitment, agency capacity. You have to have an action plan. You've got to be monitoring efforts and show progress. That seems like a reasonable 5 sets of criteria that you can accomplish. I have the scorecard according to GAO. 25 years in a row, you failed to meet hit the criteria on those 5. And consequently, that's why we're highlighting this. I think you're all well-intentioned. I think you're all very talented individuals. But the massive bureaucracy within the organizations that you represent here today, it's failing to meet these modest goals. And that's what's so frustrating. Things are going to pop up. Challenges are going to rise. But 25 years in a row is just not good enough. I heard you were making measurable progress, 6 Sigma levels, good news to report. I'm sorry, you don't have good news to report. The bad news is you're back again. We don't want to keep having these hearings. We want to show the progress. And I really do appreciate the good men and women who spent untold number of hours and literally years going through the details of what's happening within these departments and agencies. As a follow-up, I don't expect you to do this off the top of your head. One of my concerns is, who's held accountable? Like, who actually is held accountable? We asked, I think, at the very beginning, one of our members asked a good question about, has anybody ever been fired? I think it was Mr. Hurd who asked, has anybody been fired? Anybody dismissed? Anybody transferred by not meeting these goals? We have thousands of good quality people who work for the Federal Government. These are employees who wake up, they're patriotic, they work hard, they're trying to do their best, but somehow, some way in these 5 areas, it's totally fallen down. We're not achieving the goals. Again, the criteria put forward by the GAO doesn't say that you have to solve this. It needs to say that you're on the trajectory to actually getting it solved. So part of the follow-up that we would appreciate is, who's held accountable? What happens if you don't meet these goals? Because some of these are astronomically large. I mean, We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. If you just take, you want to wipe out the federal deficit, you just look at the uncollected taxes and the problems that we have in waste, fraud, and abuse going out the door through HHS. That more than wipes out all the deficit, just right there, just those two things. It's not very easily done. But the waste, the fraud, the abuse, and you look at the people who work hard and pay their taxes and they're doing everything that they can, and then they hear hundreds of billions of dollars going out that's either not collected or going out erroneously, and the waste and the fraud and the abuse, they just throw up their hands. You know, their $2,500 means something in their lives, and yet the numbers here are so big. I do not understand why the 5 that are highlighted here, there's 6 programs, 2 at the Department of Defense, why you can't hit those 5 goals. And according to the GAO, like the Medicare program, they've only met 1 of the 5 goals, 4 partially. On the 2 DOD programs, met 1 of the 5 criteria. 4 are partially met. At the Department of Energy, 1 partially met, 1 fully met, 3 not met at all. So 25 years in a row. I don't want to come back and have this same hearing at the beginning of the next Congress. I want you all to solve it. The committee would like to know and hear from you, how are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? And again, difficult for you to answer, but I'm telling you, y'all have painted a pretty picture. It ain't so pretty. But we want to see what it is you're actually doing. What is the action plan to create an action plan? That's the hope and goal, and that's my concern. And with that, I want to yield back. I think, are there any members who wish to ask a second round of questions? Gentleman from Ohio.
I appreciate the Chair's indulgence. If we could put up these 2 slides again, Mr. Koskinen. Just want to just.
I think it was agreed by Congressman Gowdy and the Chairman that I'll come back and we'll have a full hearing about this. That we would not.
I fully expect that. Yeah.
Okay, but I'm happy to answer more questions. That's fine.
Yeah, that's the way it works. We call you here and we're allowed to ask questions because the American people want to know why the Internal Revenue Service violated their fundamental rights. So we appreciate your willingness to answer our questions on behalf of the American people. That's awful big of you, Mr. Koskinen.
Well, I'm just noting that we're going to have another hearing on this, and I've had 5 hearings on it already. But I'm happy to answer the questions.
And we still haven't got the truth, as evidenced by the headline yesterday, Mr. Koskinen. The press, the mainstream press, can't even get the documents they're requesting.
Those aren't documents they're requesting from us.
But they derive from your unlawful activity. That's the point. And that's something you got to understand as the guy who heads the agency with as much power as you do, to have that kind of attitude. That's what frustrates not just members of this committee, but all kinds of Americans. That Mr. Chairman, that is the problem. Let's go back to this, because I want to know something. This is what you told me when I asked you, when did you learn you could not get all of her emails? You learned in April. All right? Then you learned in April, and then let's put the next slide. This is the letter you sent to Senate Finance telling them, in June you sent this letter, telling them, and you used the word confirmed, that backup tapes no longer exist. So I want to know, between April, when you learned, and June, when you told the Congress and the American people, what you did to confirm that those tapes didn't exist, which we now know do exist. So what did you do to confirm that the tapes didn't exist, Mr. Koskinen?
What I did was talk to our IT people, who told me that when the tapes were finished with their 6 months, they were reused and then destroyed, and that as far as they were concerned, there was no way, we had no capacity, even if we knew where they were, to extract emails from them. And it's taken the IG 6 months, and they still haven't completed the process.
That's all you've done? That's all you did? You asked your IT people?
Right.
Was it a long conversation? Did you ask them one question? How did it go?
I asked them questions about how the backup disaster recovery process worked. What happened to the tapes.
The word confirmed is based on one conversation you had with IT people. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, those are the experts. They told me that there was no way that those tapes could be found or would be used, because if they were reused,
that's all you did.
That's all I did.
Really? An issue where repeated lies from Lois Lerner, false statements given by Doug Shulman, the unprecedented fashion in where you released the data ahead of the Inspector General's report with the plan in question that you've already tipped off the Treasury and the White House about, and all you do to confirm you lost the most important documents from the most important person in the center of the scandal, all you do is ask a question of the IT people? That's it?
We spent 6 weeks looking at the hard drives and the documents for 82 people to produce for you 24,000 more Lois Lerner emails. That was what we did. Who
was this person, this one conversation you had to confirm you lost valuable documents from the central figure in this entire scandal? Who was this one person you asked that question to? Can you give us the name?
That would have been Steve Manning, who's the senior IT guy, and I asked him, could we find, were those tapes available? He said no, and then we decided what we could do, is what we did do, was we looked at all of the emails to and from Lois Lerner from 80 people and produced for you 24,000 emails.
I'm focused on the word you used, confirm.
Confirmed. I told you.
Confirm was one conversation with one IT guy that turned out not to be true. And here's the big picture. Your chief counselor, Kate Duvall, knew in February you had problems with Lois Lerner's emails. You learned in April, and you didn't tell us until June. So from February to June, you learned there's big problems, and the only thing you do to confirm that there are big problems is one question to your IT guy.
I knew in April we spent 6 weeks.
We spent 6 weeks and fundamental rights were violated.
A lot of time to get 24,000 emails for you, which was, at that time, we thought the most we could do, the best we could do. We thought, in fact, it was an extraordinary effort to go back through all of that to get you the additional 24,000 emails, which, by the way, apparently I don't have much interest in them because there have been
one conversation, Mr. Chairman, one conversation with an IT guy, and he writes the U.S. Congress and tells the American people, we've lost Lois Lerner's emails. And then, one last question if I could, Mr. Koskinen. When did you learn from TIGTA that they had actually found these tapes and could recover her emails?
I haven't learned yet that they could recover. I learned that we helped them find, they went through the system, and our people helped them find by the early part, late July, early August, they said they thought they had found the tapes from that time.
Wait. Let me, this important point, if I could, Mr. Chairman. So literally a month after you, in July and early August, a month after you said we confirmed that backup tapes no longer exist, TIGTA had the backup tapes?
TIGTA with our people.
Within a month, they got the tapes that you confirmed didn't exist?
That's exactly right.
Oh, my goodness.
Thank the gentleman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Recognize the ranking member.
You know, we can, sitting here and listening to all of this, I'm just trying to figure out how do we move forward. You know, you all been on the list for 25 years. It's a long time. Administration after administration. And at some point, we need to get off this merry-go-round. And, you know, one of the things that I've noticed after being here for 18 years now is that there's a tendency for, I think it was Mr. Gowdy who said it, or somebody up there, that folks wait for another administration or another Congress, and then we just recycle the same problems. And I guess my question is very simple to each of you. If you had a magic wand and you could get this done, what would you do to get yourselves off the list? I mean, I'm serious. I mean, what does it take? And what, if you were us, what would you do to get you off the list or to have the kind of accountability that the chairman talked about? Because I got to agree with him. We're better than this. And we're just going round and round and round. We're losing hundreds of billions of dollars. We're wasting a lot of time. And it's very frustrating. And I just believe, I mean, is it that we are too big to have accountability? Is it that we are too big to be able to say, okay, this is how it's supposed to be done, and we're going to do it this way, and we're going to do it in an effective and efficient manner? I mean, you all may feel that the questions are a bit unfair and tough. So I'm going to turn the table, and why don't you all tell us what you if you were us, what would we have you do so that you get off the list, so that we can hold you accountable? We're going to start with you, Mr. McWilliams, since you have such a wonderful smile.
Thank you for your question. First of all, the point that I would make with respect to the Department of Energy and to the Chairman's comments is we have made progress, but the GAO is essentially focusing on a half a dozen large capital projects where we have had repeated problems, and we still do have problems. And so there is no effort on our part to claim success on that, and we welcome your oversight and oversight of GAO. What success we have had is in projects below the 750. I won't dwell on those, but I will point out that in the department, in NSA, for example, in the last 3 years, we're 7% below budget and on time. We've had other large projects recently, such as the National Synchrotron project, come in on budget. The problems that we have, which are systemic, are in our large capital projects, which tend to be the nuclear projects, which are among the most complex projects in the world. Therefore, what we're trying to focus on are structural changes so that they last past someone like me testifying before you for a couple of years. And that's why we've tried to create a much improved ESAB, a new project risk management committee, because that committee is meant to create enterprise-wide dialogue and challenge by all the project members from across the program so that we can avoid future problems like this and hopefully get to the bottom of the problems that we have. The last thing I would just mention, sir, is both of you talked about accountability. That has been a significant issue at the Department of Energy. When everybody is in charge of a project, nobody is in charge. And so that's why, as I mentioned earlier, the Secretary has mandated that for every project we have to have a defined owner, to the Chairman's question, so that that is the person that is accountable when things don't go correctly.
Chairman, I'm going to yield to you. I think we have a solution to this issue, and
Thank you. The Ranking Member and I, Mr. Cummings and I have chatted, and I think what we would like to do is to send each of you a letter, and we would request that you would respond within a 30-day period. What is your plan? Show us your game plan and what you need to do to accomplish that plan. Does anybody have an objection to that? Is that fair?
No, sir.
Does anybody have an objection to that? No. Can we meet that 30-day timeline if we send you a letter this week? Fair enough. This has been a long hearing. You've been very patient taking your time here. But that's what we'll do. We will send a bipartisan letter. We would ask you to respond within 30 days. Show us your game plan. And then that way I think we can go from here. We do appreciate your commitment. We appreciate your agencies. Again, most of the people, they're good, hard-working, patriotic people. But we're failing them. And if we don't address it and put a plan in place, we will be back here again. And we don't ever want to do that. So with that, this committee will stand adjourned. Thank you.